Hello, and welcome to Radio K number 7. I'm Adam Kadri. If you don't know what this show is about, go to Radio K number 1 and listen to the introduction. This time out, we've got 3 more pieces of interactive fiction from 2004, starting with Return to Ditch Day by Michael J. Roberts, which was nominated for the Zizzy Award for Best Game. And here to talk about it with me is Alex Hoffer.
So I opened up Return to Ditch Day, and my first reaction to it was surprise. Pleasant surprise, because all I really knew about it was that it was the sequel to Ditch Day Drifter, and that Ditch Day Drifter was about solving a bunch of problems on the Caltech campus. So I guess the title, Ditch Day, refers to a day when seniors ditch their classes and instead create these elaborate puzzles, which are called stacks, for other people to solve. And so it's a very pure puzzle-solving game on the Caltech campus, or at least that's what I gather, because I've never actually played Ditch Day Drifter. So Return to Ditch Day, based on the title, had a pretty good idea of what I would be expecting. I just figured it would be more of the same. But then when you actually launch your interpreter and pull up Return to Ditch Day, the first thing you see is that you are in a factory in the control room of government power plant number 6, somewhere in Southeast Asia, I think. And it is not at all what I expected. You're in this scenario that is really quite delightful, where you are trying to fix this machine that you're trying to sell to the people who operate government power plant number 6. And the entire thing is happening in this humid, hectic environment where you're constantly being attacked by mosquitoes and attended by anxious mid-level government bureaucrats. And it is extremely atmospheric. And I really, really loved it. I was actually quite disappointed that it turns out that this extremely atmospheric section is only a couple of minutes long, and that after you solve the basic puzzles in it, you then go to Pasadena, to the Caltech campus where the actual game takes place. But I really would have been very happy to have the entire game take place during the intro section, because the college campus setting is pretty much a cliche in interactive fiction at this point, but I have never seen a game that was set in a setting like the introduction. The writing is hilarious, both in the intro and later on in the game, but the things that are being described in the intro are so much more vivid. There are some excerpts that I pulled. So, for example, one scene in the intro, oh god, I'm not going to be able to pronounce these characters' names correctly. Guanmagon, is that right?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Every time I had to type Guanmagon, I had to carefully peck it out letter by letter. The second G feels like it should follow the first N, but it actually follows the M. And I think the author did a decent job of capturing the flavor of an Asian country that's not just a stand-in for an existing Asian country. It's like if East Asia had an extra peninsula on it, that's where this takes place.
Right. Yeah, like this one excerpt that I pulled out. So you have constant flavor text every turn about being bitten by mosquitoes. And then there's a quote, "The mosquito insects are a nuisance for you," Guanmagon says. "Zojo," he yells, "go fetch powerful insect repellent. Go now." Zojo walks off, muttering something. And then Zojo comes back, and there are a couple of turns where they spray the insect repellent around. And then it says, Guanmagon waves his hand to clear the air around him. "Zojo, you must not keep the powerful insect repellent vessel for so long, for our cost account will receive the excess internal late fee. Go quickly to return the vessel." Zojo lugs the tank away. And I just thought that that was very atmospheric and also very funny, of these sort of harried, low-level bureaucrats and how they would behave.
Yeah, it's 2016, and I'm not entirely sure how acceptable it is these days to laugh at fractured English, but the fractured English in this game is in fact very funny. And it comes in a couple of different forms. There are the sort of Nintendo "a winner is you" type phrasings, like when you fix the first machine and Guanmagon cheers, "This is so wonderful! Dreadful disgrace is not for us now!" Or later you see the Mitocron helicopter landing, and when you ask Zojo about it, he says, "Perhaps the representative is performing arrival." But then there are lines that are stilted but technically correct, like when Zojo is complaining in an exceedingly diplomatic way about his job. And I think this actually works better in text than it does spoken aloud, or at least I don't know how to read these so that they work as well as they do in text. But he says, "As you have surely observed, my duties are considerably variable, at the whim of my very capable superiors. This has provided many excellent opportunities for frustration." And when you ask him about Guanmagon, he says, He is most capable at providing numerous small tasks of considerable import to himself.
I think that in context, it's okay to laugh at the fractured English there because you get, not much later in the game, equally humorous fractured English from your boss, who is, by all indications, a native speaker of English. And it's this great parody of the tone of an email from a superior at your company who is so superior and so in charge that he doesn't care whether anything he writes is correct or thoughtful or anything like that. So you get this email from your boss and it's riddled with misspellings. And I was just as amused by that email as I was by the dialogue in the first scene because obviously it's exaggerated, but it's also very true. It's a little hard to read out loud why it's funny because part of the reason that it's funny is that everything is spelled wrong.
Okay, well, this doesn't do the people listening to the audio version of this any good, but I will go ahead and put up a screenshot of the email in the YouTube version.
And I love the verisimilitude in these emails. That is the positive side of one of the things that did frustrate me about this game, which is that there is a ton of verisimilitude, some of which is enjoyable and some of which is really actually kind of frustrating. One of the points at which I was most frustrated with the game is when I had to go to the library to look something up. So what you do is you walk to the library and then you look at the library floor directory to find out which floor that you need to go to based on the subject that you're trying to look up. And then you push the button for the elevator. And I did not realize until I was in my 30s and someone pointed it out to me that the number of dings an elevator makes is based on what direction it's going in. And this is captured in the implementation of this game. The elevator dings the correct number of times. Like, that's the level of detail we're getting into. So you push the button. Oh, wait, sorry. You know what? I actually left out steps. I should just go back to my notes. Right. So here's what you do. You go to the library, you show your alumni ID card to the receptionist so that you can get in. Then you read the floor directory. Then you push the up button. Then you push the elevator button for the floor that you're going to. Then you look up the title of the book that you're looking for. And then you have to push the elevator call button again. Then you get in the elevator, and then you push the button for the ground floor, and then you leave the elevator. And then you have to check out your books with the library attendant. And at this point, I was like, why am I playing a library simulator? There is so much detail here involved in checking out books from the library. This is not fun. Like, it was so detailed that I was actually worried that if I completed the game without returning my books to the library, that I would get a fine. There's this excruciating detail that doesn't really seem to be in the service of anything. And there's a lot of that in the game elsewhere. There are lots of buildings and hallways and classrooms you can go into that do not serve any purpose. They are just there in the game, as far as I can tell, because they are there in real life. One of the areas that you have to spend a lot of time in is a dorm, and I found this dorm incredibly frustrating to get around because it has this complicated entryway system. The halls do not generally run straight. They tend to run like northeast, southwest, or something like that. And there are a lot of exits listed that you can never use because they go to dorm rooms that are locked throughout the entire game, but they show up when you use the exits command. And it's very frustrating. The exterior campus actually has a very nice map that's well implemented, and you can actually type go to the name of a building that you want to go to so that you don't have to understand how it's laid out, which is great and which I really appreciated. But the interior of this building is like a maze, and there's no reason why it has to be that way, as far as I can tell, other than that it is that way in real life. So it was implemented that way, but it didn't make my experience better.
Yeah, I had the same reaction, but on more of a macro scale. I've said a few times that one reason most IF doesn't really appeal to me is that historically a lot of it has been about fixing toasters, by which I mean machines in general. And that's certainly what you're doing here. But it seems as though the author decided that the only thing more fun than fixing a toaster is going to the library and brushing up on toaster repair. You called that section of the game a library simulator, but it seems to me like the idea behind this entire game is to simulate what it's like to be an engineer who's venturing slightly beyond his area of specialization and needs to literally skim through the intro textbook before plunging in. And while that might constitute a more realistic portrait of a middle manager at an engineering firm, I'm not sure it makes for great entertainment.
It seems like a well-written, accurate simulation of something that I just didn't find fun. But speaking of how this is an accurate simulation of being an engineer who is kind of rusty, one scene that I did find to be very realistic and amusing is when you go to the guy who can program the calculator, and he says, no, the sun would go supernova before the program ever finished. And then what you have to do is you give him a journal article talking about quantum computing and how it might be possible to run really complex programs in a short amount of time. And then once he reads that journal article, he becomes so excited that he takes the calculator from you and wants to program the function in it, which I thought was pretty funny and a pretty accurate representation of working with engineers, where they won't do something because you ask them to, but when you show them that it could be really cool, then they're very excited to go do it.
Yeah, I wouldn't actually know. This is a foreign world to me, and there were actually moments that kept throwing me out of the story, even though they shouldn't have. Like, there's a point early on when your character says to himself, "Of course, the Dynatest is just the kind of low-power application where you'd find an XT772LV." And I was like, oh, yes, of course. And later on, the game says things like, the only thing you really remember about quantum physics is some stuff about semiconductor band gaps. And you start to recognize the standard building blocks, Fourier series, Laplace transforms, PDEs. And I'd heard the phrase Fourier series before, but I didn't know what they were until I Googled them. I'd never heard of Laplace transforms, and I still don't know what PDEs are. And the thing is, I know this is characterization. Like, if this were one of those games where you're a wizard, it would be a totally standard thing to say things like, you read the spellbook and start to recognize the standard building blocks, Vishanti meditation, astral incursions. And in a case like that, I wouldn't worry about the fact that I didn't know what those things were, because obviously no one could, because they're made up. But the fact is that at various points in its history, IF pretty much has been a medium for tech people to write games for other tech people. So even though the game's documentation kept reassuring me that no, I didn't actually have to know any engineering, I kept wondering myself whether that was really true.
Yeah, no, I noticed the same thing about the writing. It was a little frightening to me at first because I thought, wait, am I supposed to be able to understand this? And it became extra confusing when you get to the parts that are science fiction. Because for someone like me who has only a very basic understanding of electrical engineering, it's not completely obvious which parts are real and which parts are turning into science fiction. But I appreciate the fact that the real parts are real. So if you do know electrical engineering, you can be like, yeah, cool. And if you don't know electrical engineering, it doesn't really matter. When I was fiddling with the machine outside Stammer's room, it did kind of bring me back a little bit to my intro to electrical engineering class back in college, and I kind of enjoyed that.
Yeah, I've seen other people saying the same thing. I guess it depends on how much of a gap you have to bridge. Like, very early on, there's a part where you're looking for a chip, and the hints say, did you notice that the circuit tester has a removable back cover? Did you read the warning labels? You're supposed to be an engineer, right? Would an engineer pay attention to a warning not to open the back cover? And I was like, I don't know. I don't really know anything about engineers. I do know that I would obey a warning label like that, so that's what I did, and therefore I couldn't solve the puzzle until the hints told me to disregard the warning label.
Oh no, I thought it was a huge hint. Like, obviously you're supposed to open this.
Yeah, it probably is obvious to people who are into games like this, but I am not one of them. Like, when a friend tried to get me to play Undertale, I got stuck because a character told me to stay put, and so I just stayed put, and nothing happened, and I turned it off. But all in all, while Return to Ditch Day was very much not for me, the execution was strong enough that it still made me zip over to IFDB to see whether Michael J. Roberts had written anything else that might be more up my alley. Maybe something that wasn't a puzzle game.
One thing that surprised me about this game is, it's a puzzle game. The entire premise is actually built around solving this totally artificial puzzle just to prove to the person who built the puzzle that you're smart. And I actually felt that the puzzles were probably the weakest part of the game. I enjoyed the writing, I enjoyed the characters, I enjoyed some of the wacky stuff that was going on. I actually did not enjoy the puzzles very much. There were basically two categories of puzzle. There was the category of puzzle where all you are doing is following very explicit instructions. So, for example, there's a part where you have to program a network analyzer, and the network analyzer has written instructions that do literally tell you everything that you need to do, and all you have to do is follow the instructions. So that's not really a puzzle to me if you're doing exactly what you're told. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there are puzzles where it is completely impossible to make any progress unless you happen to interact with the right thing. So the place where I got stuck, for example, is you need to get these functions programmed on your calculator. And the way that you do that is you talk to a student who is an expert in programming calculators. But the only way that you know that you should talk to that student about that is there's a newspaper stand in the campus bookstore, and you can read an article that talks about this student and how he is a genius at programming calculators. But if you don't happen to look at that particular piece of scenery in the bookstore, which I didn't because it just seemed like scenery, and when you go to the bookstore, there's something else in the bookstore that you clearly do need for a different puzzle, and so I was like, oh, okay, that's why the bookstore is there, to get me that item, and once I've gotten that item, I'm kind of done with the bookstore. Unless you read that article, there is absolutely no way to make progress. So there were a number of places like that where I was just completely stuck because the thing that I had to do to make progress was not an action that seemed motivated in any way. And to me, most of the puzzles fell into one of those two categories. There are a couple of puzzles where you actually have to do pretty fun, creative things. I thought the puzzle where you have to scare the technician who is afraid of mice, I really enjoyed that puzzle because it was logical and you were given all the pieces of information that you needed to know to solve it, and then you could put those together and come up with a solution that wasn't completely obvious but that made total sense. But I felt that most puzzles in the game didn't actually meet those criteria, and I felt that the puzzles were really a weakness of the game.
Yeah, I can't really speak to the puzzle since once I got to Caltech, I kind of hit the wall pretty quickly, and so I just followed a walkthrough after that. So I can't actually say how hard the puzzles are or how fair they are or even how much freedom you have regarding how many of the puzzles you do or the order you do them in.
There is an optional plot in the game, and the optional plot is about finding out about the villain and the villain's motivations. It's not a very large part of the game. You can probably do the optional section in maybe like 30-40 minutes. But if you don't do the optional section, I do feel like you lose out of a lot of flavor of the game. And I was actually surprised that it's optional because it's not substantially harder than the rest of the game. And it seemed like it would have been a better game design to not have those parts be optional because they are so important to having a full experience of the game. And it's very easy to actually solve the game without realizing that you are about to lock yourself into the end game that you can't get out of, which I actually did by accident. So I didn't get why it was not a mandatory part of the game.
Yeah, I think I've talked about this sort of problem on the show already, but what you're describing sounds like the sort of thing that crops up in games like All Roads by John Ingold, where the interactivity consists of giving the player the freedom to experience a worse story, and not in the sense that worse things happen to your character, but just that the story that you see makes less sense and has less interesting stuff in it. And to finish my thought from before, even though the subject matter of this game was of basically zero interest to me, it did have interesting stuff in it. All of the little details are great. Like, I loved the pamphlet that you find in the student center where an aerospace contractor is recruiting potential employees, and the pamphlet says, "Here at Locktheon, we know that the advanced defense systems that keep America safe today are the same devastating weapons that will threaten America tomorrow. That's why we at Locktheon can never stop innovating."
That's pretty good. Yeah, pretty much at any point when this game gives you a big chunk of text, it's a pretty delightful moment. There's a part where you have lunch with the students and you talk about your career and life choices, and it's actually kind of poignant, making the story have a bit of emotional weight and stakes that's a little bit more than just can you recruit this one student or not. Yeah, I love the writing.
Unfortunately, it looks like Return to Ditch Day is in fact the most recent game by Michael J. Roberts. So, even if he does write another one, we'll have many, many years worth of other games to work through before we get to it. Because we still have quite a few games just from '04 left to go, and moving from Caltech to MIT, here's Jess Haskins to talk with me about All Things Devours by Toby Ord. All Things Devours won 3rd place in the 2004 comp, and won the Zizzy that year for Best Individual Puzzle. You play Natalie Williams, a grad student at MIT, sneaking into your lab at 4:17 a.m. in order to blow it up. Why? Because the military has seized your time machine, and is about to conduct an experiment with it that will cause inconsistencies in the timeline. And according to your calculations, observing those inconsistencies will blow up a big chunk of New England. The problem is that when you get to your lab, you discover that your notes are missing, and in order to retrieve them, you will have to go back in time without causing any observed inconsistencies. So, what'd you think?
This game was obviously a kind of puzzle box. It's very small, very tight, very puzzly. It's basically one huge puzzle. That's usually not my kind of thing, so I went into it knowing that I was probably going to get frustrated and not figure it out on my own and sort of try and figure out as much as I could and then go and get hints. Like, it took me a long time to even figure out like exactly what the device did and how it worked. And the clue is there in the title. It's All Things Devours, which is a reference to that Tolkien poem that's a riddle about time. I thought it was funny, apparently. A lot of people just didn't get the reference and thought it was a typo. It's like, what is this? Like, it's All Things Devour. But yeah, even getting the reference, I think my first impression was that it was a duplicating machine. I think because when I first got into the prototype, I consistently entered very low numbers, which just led to me going back in time like a few seconds and encountering myself. And I thought like, oh, this is a machine that makes body doubles. And I had all these big plans about like, well, I need two of me so one person can push the button while the other one goes through the door. And I need to stick the battery in the machine and turn it around so I can have two batteries and all of this stuff just based on like not even having figured out the very first step of how the machine works.
Yeah, I also had a second me pop up next to me, but I did figure out that it was due to a few seconds worth of time travel, probably because I've seen that trick done in comics before. Not that it actually helped me any. It very quickly became clear that I had no chance of figuring this out. I took a few swings at it, but after I'd blown up Boston 3 or 4 times, I went to the walkthrough.
I blew up Boston a lot more than that.
Yeah, as much as I fantasized about that while having to navigate the streets there, I just didn't have the patience for that. What I ended up doing was I used the replay command to enter the entire walkthrough into the program, and then I just read the output like a story. And that story didn't make sense, but
because you have to arrive at that series of steps via having tried all of the dead ends and worked out why you have to be hiding in this room at this particular time. So
exactly. So I wound up going through again, and this time I entered the walkthrough in smaller chunks, and after each little chunk I would try some wrong moves to find out why the right moves were right.
One of the main uses for the walkthrough for me was just figuring out the initial time setting to set it back to. Because like I said, I started with way too short, and then it's a pretty small window because if you go too long, the guard shows up. So narrowing down that initial window where, all right, I won't get immediately arrested and I won't immediately blow up without narrowing that down for myself. And then I worked on the battery thing for a long time. I made that battery run like over and over and over and kept running into myself. And I was not willing to sit down and track to the second where my previous self was in each room, which I guess is pretty much what you're supposed to do. Also, I was a little bit handicapped because I generally don't pay that much attention to the status line, and I didn't notice that it was telling me the timestamp.
Oh yeah, I don't know how anyone would have a prayer without tracking the time on the status line. Although, did you happen across this message? If you do track the time on the status line, you see that every turn is 5 seconds long. And it turns out that if you hop into the time machine and you enter a number of seconds to go back that is not a multiple of 5, the game says, you pause for a moment after pressing the button, carefully resynchronizing yourself with the 5-second turn increments.
It did not ever occur to me to try that. That's pretty cute.
Now, as you've noted, there's not much to this game other than the one big puzzle. Like, normally I would prefer to talk about things like characterization and theme, but in this game, these are not priorities.
Yeah, I mean, technically, I imagine this is actually pretty impressive in the way that it's constructed to record all of your movements and all of that. I mean, looking at this game as a logical and engineering marvel, just on that basis, it's pretty neat.
Yeah, there's certainly something to be said for the notion that this is the sort of premise that you would expect to generate hundreds of thousands of bugs, and yet it does in fact seem to be pretty clean. But there is something that bugged me about it, which is this. It's a pretty standard trope in IF to have the player learn things by dying. For example, in 1999, I put out a game called Varicella, in which you play a Renaissance courtier trying to eliminate your rivals. And the game says flat out that you know the palace like the back of your hand and that you have a perfect plan to win the throne. But the first time you play the game, you don't know where anything is, and you have no idea how to achieve your goal. But after playing dozens of times and losing, you do know the palace like the back of your hand, and you do know exactly what steps you want to take in order to win. So you have developed the skills that the character supposedly had to begin with. Now, in all Things Devours, you're told flat out that your initial plan has gone awry. When you discover that your notes are missing, you're surprised. So I guess the idea is that you then hatch a perfect plan right there on the spot. And that plan requires perfect knowledge, because as soon as you discover that your notes aren't where you'd thought they'd be, you need to know where they actually are. You also need to know what's in all the storage rooms, and you need to know exactly how to time things. Like, there's a door on the second floor that opens with the push of a button on the first floor, and after pushing the button, you can't get to that door by the time it closes again. So you actually have to press the button, go downstairs into the lab, go back in time, head upstairs without running into yourself, and be waiting on the second floor when the door opens your next time through the time loop. Now, maybe Natalie has enough pre-existing knowledge and is enough of a genius to be able to do all this, but for the player, it's impossible. For one thing, you, the player, don't know where the notes are. You have to find out by trial and error, and every error means blowing up Boston. So, All Things Devours is a learn-by-dying game. And what bugged me about this is that you already have an undo mechanism in the game, the time travel. So to also require the IF meta commands so that you're undoing things both inside and outside the story felt weird.
Yeah, especially given that it has this time-bending sci-fi presence. It doesn't seem like it would have been too hard to include a narrative reason, a kind of like every time she dies, she is back in this spot and she gets to try again. The character experiences this series of time loops until she gets out of it. It may have to be a little hokey, but I guess you get to restart time and live and die an infinite number of times until you figure something out trope is kind of hacky already, but at least then it would sort of all be in world and you wouldn't have these weird paradoxes where she walks in and presses a button for no reason and then goes and discovers something and then does all this improbable series of maneuvers. Like in the case of your game that you mentioned, that was part of the conceit. Here it's just kind of, at least in terms of the story, it's a thing that you have to ignore because it makes the puzzle work.
Yeah, it occurs to me that the fact that Natalie needs to have exceptional knowledge might be the main reason that she's a separate character at all. Because the classical approach would just be to say that some nameless you are the one sabotaging the time machine. But the problem with that is that you, the player, don't know that the lab has a conference room on your first playthrough. So doing it this way, the author can say, all right, you don't know that, but Natalie does. But making Natalie a separate named person is certainly not done for the sake of characterization, because Natalie has no discernible personality.
There being very little in the way of story elements, we really learn nothing except that she's a young female researcher, and she does talk a little bit about like her motivations, like the military came in and took the project, but the character really could have been anybody. A lot of the reviews did call out that examine self, which I don't think it actually ever occurred to me to do, although maybe I should get in the habit of doing that more. But people said like, oh, it doesn't sound like how it sounds when someone is considering themselves. It sounds like a third person description. I had it here. Dark hair frames a warm face. Despite the anxiety written now in your tense brow, the confidence of youth and vibrancy of intellect are clear. There is a depth in your clear green eyes. And yeah, nobody thinks about the depth in their clear green eyes. And then I think there's another thing where you can look at the ID card and it talks about like the picture and like when she wore her hair long. So that's two references about her hair in a game where like most things have no description and there's no time to even look at anything. And yeah, there was a little bit of interesting discussion about that, like in the reviews. Some were a little off the mark. It's like, oh, it's this glamorous, idealized, sexualized something. And then the author addressed it in the comments later too. Well, it's not actually about her attractiveness and stuff. It's about like confidence and intellect and all of those things. But at the same time, something about how it's written, it does remind me of, there's this Twitter account that's all about the introductions for like the female leads in movie scripts. And they're all over the top, and it's about their hair and about their careworn face, but their beauty still shines through, and exotic, romanticized descriptions, mostly telling us how young and attractive they are despite momentary anxiety written in the tense brow, or the hard things you've been through, or all of that stuff, but still like great hair and shining, clear, natural beauty. So, yeah, I just thought that that was an interesting discussion. I did appreciate that both of the reviewers brought it up and that the author addressed it too, and was even like, yeah, I sort of see your point. Maybe in a future version I'd revise that a little bit. It just goes to show that looking at the representations of marginalized characters, female characters, even in like the most straightforward, like it's not even character based, the character's barely a character, it's all like plot and mechanics driven. Even there's common pitfalls that people fall into just that are the tropes, because when you introduce a female character, you do talk about her hair and the sensitivity in her eyes or whatever.
Or you could save a step and talk about the sensitivity in her hair. But one thing that occurs to me about that observation, that the response to "examine me" sounds like a third party's description of the character, one thing about early IF is that narratologically, it was all over the place. Like nowadays, and I'm including 2004 as nowadays, if you type a command to eat something, a game will reply by saying, "You eat the pie, not bad," or something like that. But back in the day, there were games that said, "Thank you, it was delicious," as if it were the character talking, even though the character doesn't talk to you at any other point. Or the game might say, "I don't think the pie would agree with you," which raises the question of, who is this I? Who's talking? And while you could look at things by typing "examine," which is clearly a command for your character, you could also type "describe," which would be a command for the game, or at least for the narrator, and the result was exactly the same. And this was included in Inform as a legacy thing, and I checked, and it is in all Things Devours, which means that the third-party text you're talking about is also the response to the command "describe me." And in that context, it makes a lot more sense. Though it's worth noting that "describe Natalie" and "examine Natalie" do not work, which I would call a bug.
I would be interested in collecting a list of "examine me" prompts from just a ton of different games. Fascinating to see side by side, I think. Also, maybe if the character does differ from the presumed audience, like if you're just, oh yeah, I'm male adventurer kid doing whatever, but if you have a character who's conspicuously a woman or a robot or a dragon or something that the typical like gamer player isn't, although maybe I'm making assumptions about how closely the IF reader audience is identified with the presumed male gamer audience. But let's just assume mostly male. Would those other characters tend to take the third person perspective more often, and the more non-other characters just be, oh, you look at yourself, hey, you're wearing some scuffed up shoes and you just rolled out of bed, ready to adventure?
I don't know, that's a really good question. I should point out that technically, this entire art form was invented for the benefit of little girls. Will Crowther wrote Adventure after his divorce so that he could entertain his daughters when they visited. And after that, yeah, I'm guessing that the audience demographics in the Infocom days skewed heavily male, just insofar as computer users skewed heavily male. I know firsthand that the IF newsgroups in the 90s were predominantly male, though as I recall, it was more like 75% than 99%. Nowadays, I don't know. The same way that superhero comics used to be written for 8-year-old boys, and then 20 years later were written for 14-year-old boys, and then 20 years after that for 35-year-old men, and now seem to be written mainly for 20-year-old women on Tumblr. I've gathered that the demographics of people who play story games in particular has radically shifted just in the last few years. So I'm guessing that right now it's mostly female robot dragons. All right, our last game for this installment is Sting of the Wasp by Jason Devlin. And here to talk about it with me is a new guest, Janice Eisen. So before we get to the game, let's meet Janice.
I am old enough that I played the original mainframe Zork at MIT as a student in the early 80s and was instantly addicted to it. And once Infocom started producing games, I was addicted to those. And fortunately, I knew someone who knew someone and was able to get a gig as an outside beta tester for several years and tested a number of games, including Bureaucracy, Beyond Zork, the entire Enchanter series, bunch of others, and really enjoyed it. But then when Infocom cratered, as far as I was concerned, text adventures, as we called them then, were dead. And I had no idea that there was this vibrant amateur IF community going on. But fortunately, I raised my sons on Infocom as well. And so when my older son sent me a note saying there was this new game called Haitian Lands that he thought I'd like, I didn't need any convincing, and that led me to the IF forums and the discovery of just how alive IF was.
So, any fun stories from the Infocom days?
I didn't actually know any of the imps. They were several years older than I was, and I was not part of the group that had hung with them. In fact, they particularly disliked a couple of people I know, including one who got inserted in, I think it was Beyond Zork, as a monster in that game. There were all kinds of weird connections, like the Infocom guys had a particular rivalry with the Tech, which is a student newspaper. So when Planetfall came out, the ID card you get with it has a number on it, which was the phone number for the Tech. And we actually got a few calls there from people who were stuck on the game and wanted help and that said, oh, this looks like a phone number. And of course, most of the time people had no idea what was going on. But one time I was actually there when someone called and was able to help them get past what they were stuck on for Planetfall.
All right, well, let's get to it. Sting of the Wasp came in 4th in the 2004 IF competition and won the Zizzy Awards for Best Non-Player Characters and Best Player Character. That player character is Julia Hawthorne, a middle-aged socialite who's just been photographed having sex with the golf pro at her country club. Your job is to get that photo back by any means necessary before your husband can see it. Sting of the Wasp has been most frequently compared to a game from 1999 called Varicella, which puts me in an unusual position to comment because I wrote Varicella. I actually talked about it a little bit in the last segment, but that was about the learn by dying aspect. The comparisons here are because in both games, the player character sets out to dispose of a slew of rivals using underhanded means. But it seems to me that there are a couple of important differences. One is that when I was writing Varicella, it seemed to me that in order to make playing a bad guy more palatable, his enemies should be even worse. So Primo Varicella may resort to bribery and treachery and even murder, but unlike the people he's knocking off, he's not going around raping or torturing anyone.
Right.
That's why the character is named Varicella. You know, it translates to chickenpox, which is a disease, but as diseases go, you can do a whole lot worse than chickenpox.
Oh, I didn't realize that was, I thought it was just a little joke. Oh, okay.
No, that was the idea from the start. And I also threw in some characters who aren't targets and who aren't all bad. You know, Charlotte is kind of princessy, but people do seem to like her pretty well, and the chef is kind of a smartass, but he's a good guy. But in Sting of the Wasp, everyone is horrible. And the player character, Julia, is probably the worst of them all.
Yeah, I mean, I don't hang out in that crowd. I never have, and I don't have much good to say about them, but there isn't a single decent thing about any of these people.
Now, the other difference is that the world of Varicella has been called bleak and nihilistic, and I think one review said that it was a place where life is miserable and human happiness is impossible, and all of those are fair charges, but for all its negativity, Varicella is not an attack on anyone. I mean, I guess you could come away from it thinking, dang, those Renaissance courtiers are just the worst, but that would be kind of missing the point. But Sting of the Wasp is very much an exercise in relentlessly mocking a certain class of women. And I'm not exactly a fan of the Maris Cranes of the world myself, but still, the sheer venom of this game kind of left a sour taste in my mouth.
Absolutely. I saw all the reviews, people talking about how funny it was. I just found it so mean-spirited and unpleasant. And I was wondering, do I have no sense of humor or what? But you're doing these terrible things to people who haven't really done anything to you. I felt like I wanted to take a shower after playing it.
I was actually kind of perplexed because the author, Jason Devlin, includes an about the author blurb in the game, and it left me wondering, how does a 20-year-old male science major from a small town in British Columbia have such an axe to grind against 50-year-old socialites? It seems like such a bizarre target given the source, and I wondered whether there was some sort of backstory there.
People like Jane Austen or Nancy Mitford are writing about this class from the inside, and he's writing about it from the outside, so it's also pretty shallow stereotypes about these people.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, people always talk about how you're allowed to joke about a subculture if you're inside it, but not if you're outside it. And some people say, oh, you're allowed to joke about it from outside if you're punching up, but not if you're punching down. But what you just said sort of got me thinking. To me, what's really funny is when you hear a humorous observation that gives you a shock of recognition, but that you haven't heard other people make. And that's true whether it's inside or outside or up or down. But when you've got jokes that are just one subculture repeating tired old observations about another subculture, that's just tribalism. It's the difference between Silicon Valley on HBO and 1980s nerd movies, or between Chris Rock and Fuzzy Zeller. Now, I'm not super familiar with the authors that you just mentioned. Nancy Mitford came up in my linguistics classes, but I haven't read her. And the only Jane Austen I've read is Sense and Sensibility, and I've heard her later novels are more explicitly about high society. Is that right?
Jane Austen is set among the landed gentry, and it's gentle satire of them. But one of the big differences, aside from the fact that there are likable people in her novels, and generally the protagonists are likable enough, is that in Jane Austen's novels, the protagonist learns something and becomes better, to oversimplify. But nobody learns anything in Sting of the Wasp.
Well, the refrain of the writing staff of Seinfeld was, no hugging, no learning. And Jason Devlin seems to have signed on to that. And it's easy to see why that was so popular when Seinfeld did it, because after decades of saccharine sitcoms with a pat moral to every story, the nihilism was actually kind of refreshing. But it's very easy to find yourself trying a little too hard to be edgy, especially when you're 20. But to go back to the comedy as punching thing that I was talking about before, when I was in my early 20s, I have to admit, I took part in my share of internet flame wars. I thought it was really fun to show off how cleverly I could tear apart a worthy target. And if you want a worthy target, the vain, contemptuous one-percenters that we see in Sting of the Wasp certainly fit the bill. But the thing about the kind of bile that goes into a flame war or that goes into an acidic satire is that whether you're on the receiving end or you're the one dishing it out or you're just watching the bile get tossed around, it's corrosive. And eventually the damage adds up. So I wonder how much the fact that Sting of the Wasp left me kinda cold has to do with my age. If I'd played this when it first came out, maybe I would've liked it then. But these days, I'm just getting close to my lifetime quota of hate.
That's a good point. I think you are right about that. I might be curious what my sons, who are both in their 20s, would think of it. Maybe they'll play it after they listen to this podcast.
Alright, I want to circle back around and pick up another thread. Like I said, it did seem weird that this 20-year-old guy would make 50-year-old women his primary target. So let me just ask you flat out, is Sting of the Wasp misogynistic?
I doubt he intended it to be misogynistic, but all the women in the game are villainous, shallow, and awful, except for one NPC who is merely shallow and stupid. The men are basically victims of the women, except for one NPC who is cleverly wielded against another woman by the player character. In other words, women run the social system, use, abuse, and trick men, view husbands solely as sources of money and jewelry, attack one another viciously, and slut around. This is the world as seen by the worst elements of what has been called the manosphere on the internet, the men's rights activists and the red pillars and the different flavors thereof. It just is such a caricature of how women act that I see so frequently. There's a line, the comments on any online article about feminism are enough to justify the existence of feminism. And you see this kind of bile all over. So like I said, I suspect that Jason Devlin did not intend to be misogynistic. I don't know why he chose to make all his characters, or nearly all the characters, women, but it certainly comes off that way.
Yeah, my guess would be that the game wasn't meant to be misogynistic so much as misanthropic, because everyone in the game is terrible. But the men and women are terrible in different ways. And while I don't think I would have made this connection if you hadn't pointed it out, you're right. Anyone who's been on the internet since Chans became a thing has seen proud misogynists describe the way they think women operate. And intentionally or not, this game is an instantiation of that worldview.
I'm sure he probably would say that it's just this class of people. But unfortunately, he's working in a culture that has this misogynistic view of how women run society and use men, and that came through in the game. I certainly don't think he did that deliberately, but it was pretty unpleasant, that part of it. It's not like I don't think misogyny is some sort of disqualifier for a game, but it's just one more thing that makes this very unpleasant to play, at least for a woman.
Okay, well, before we wrap things up, we should probably spend at least a little bit of time talking about how well this works as a game. So, any thoughts on that?
Overall, I think as a game, it works pretty well. You have your goal right away. Most of the puzzles are well clued. It only took me a couple of tries to get through most of them. But some of them are difficult not because the player can't figure out what the goal is, but because the room descriptions don't make things clear enough, or because the game doesn't give nudges in the right direction. I did have to go to the walkthrough because I couldn't figure out why I couldn't get to the pro shop. I couldn't find it, and it's because there's a bad mapping error in the game. And then there are red herrings, like early on you notice that one character has a lump in her bra, and that is clearly the photograph you are looking for, but you cannot talk to her about it. You certainly can't grab it from her. You can't even attack that character until you have gone through every other character that you have to get rid of for no clear reason. But I did really like the way some of the puzzles have alternate solutions, always a good thing. And the fact that he replaced a lot of the standard parser error messages with something clever that varies depending on where you are and what NPCs are present, and also little touches like if you're carrying the bleach around, one character will notice it and make a crack about, is that what you're using to dye your hair these days? These are the kind of details that make a game richer and more fun to play. Obviously, it has some serious flaws in terms of playability as well, but if those had been fixed, it would have been an extremely playable game. That and the fact that there were a lot of errors in English that, as a professional editor, that always jumps out at me.
Yeah, I found a major English error in each of the first 3 substantial chunks of text that I encountered, and after the third one, I just stopped noting them down. So this is becoming a recurring theme on this show, but I gotta say, I saw that the acknowledgments to this game listed a bunch of beta testers, but come on folks, you gotta throw an actual editor into the mix.
Hire an editor!
So, concluding thoughts?
I'm the kind of person who feels bad about hurting NPCs in games in general, and so I really felt bad about there's an old woman who never hurt you, but you make her hair fall out in order to distract someone so you can get the information you need, and you are just 100% terrible. And yeah, it was not fun. I enjoyed solving the puzzles, but no, it was not, and I understand that a game actually does not have to be fun, if that is the point, maybe, that it's not fun, but I don't think that was the point of this game. I think it was intended to be fun and funny, and some people certainly seem to have found it that, according to the reviews I've seen, but not fun. With my vote.
Yeah, it occurs to me that in this segment I've brought up Frasier, Seinfeld, and Silicon Valley, but to finish up with The Simpsons, Sting of the Wasp does seem to me to be pretty much an exercise in kill wealthy dowager. And that wraps it up for Radio K number 7. Thanks to my guests, Alex Hoffer, Jess Haskins, and Janice Eisen, and to the authors of the games we covered, Michael J. Roberts, Toby Ord, and Jason Devlin. And thank you for listening. Bye for now.